Behind the barbed wire of Camp Hearn, a group of German women prisoners stood trembling, their hands pressed to their coats. They had been taught that Americans would hate them, that capture meant punishment, not mercy. But then, something unexpected happened. A young American guard took off his own blanket, walked to the fence, and handed it through the wire. No words, no orders, just quiet kindness between enemies. That single moment would live in her memory forever, because it wasn't about war anymore. It was about humanity. Stay till the end of this true story to see how one simple act of kindness changed lives across oceans. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support our channel so we can keep sharing real stories that history almost forgot. December 1944. The wind in Texas carried the smell of dust and cold metal. The sky was pale gray, and frost clung to every surface like glass. Trucks rolled through the open gates of Camp Hearn, their engines coughing in the freezing air. Inside the trucks sat a group of German women, prisoners of war, nurses, clerks, and wives who had followed the German army across Europe. They were tired, cold, and silent. No one spoke. Their faces were pale from long travel and fear of the unknown. When the truck stopped, an American officer gave a short order. The women climbed down, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. A few carried small bags, the only things left from their old lives. Behind the wire fences, rows of wooden barracks stood in neat line. A flag fluttered weakly over the camp, the stars and stripes, a symbol that once meant the enemy, now the shape of their new world. They had been told many things before coming here. Some said Americans would beat them. Others whispered that women were treated worse, that they would be starved, insulted, or used for propaganda. As one prisoner later wrote in her diary, "We were ready to suffer. We expected nothing else. But from the moment they stepped inside, something felt strange. The guards didn't shout. No dogs barked. The Americans didn't seem angry or cruel. Instead, they worked with quiet order, checking names, handing out blankets, and showing where each group should sleep. Inside the barracks, it was warmer than outside. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and baked bread from the kitchen nearby. The women stood still, unsure what to do. An older woman named Hilde, who had worked as a nurse in Belgium, whispered, "It smells like a home." Her voice shook, not from cold, but confusion. In Europe, they had seen prisons full of suffering. They had watched soldiers punish civilians, seen hunger spread through villages, and believed every army was cruel. But here, behind American fences, the rhythm was calm, almost human. One guard even tried to speak in broken German. "You okay?" "Cold, yes?" He offered a small smile, then moved on. Each woman received a number and a bed, a simple wooden frame, a straw mattress, and a rough brown blanket. It wasn't luxury, but compared to the freezing boxcars they had traveled in, it felt unreal. The barracks echoed with the sound of shivering breaths and the soft thud of boots on wood. Outside, Private James Larkin stood watch in the cold. He was 23 from Oklahoma and had never been this close to prisoners before. He had seen war from afar, training camps, drills, telegrams announcing losses, but never the faces of the enemy. Yet when he looked at the women, their thin coats, their tired eyes, he didn't see enemies. He saw people who looked as worn out as his own mother after long harvest seasons. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing. The women huddled together for warmth, whispering prayers and songs from home. The wind howled through cracks in the walls. Larkin saw them from his guard post. His fingers were numb even inside gloves, but he noticed one woman sitting apart from the others, shaking badly. She had wrapped her scarf around her head, but it wasn't enough. He hesitated. Rules said guards were not to interact with prisoners unless ordered. But watching her tremble, something in him stirred. Later he would remember thinking, "It was war, but that didn't mean I had to be cold inside." The next morning, the women were woken by the clang of the mess bell. They expected to find thin soup or stale bread. Instead, they were handed trays with eggs, oatmeal, and even small pieces of butter. One woman cried quietly over her meal. The guard who served her looked puzzled and said, "Ma'am, it's just breakfast." But to her, it was proof that not every part of war was cruel. That first day ended without a single threat, beating, or insult. The women lay awake that night, whispering to each other, wondering if this kindness was a trick. Hilda wrote later, "It felt like a dream. We were prisoners, but someone had remembered we were still human." As frost glittered outside the barracks and the guards changed shifts, Larkin passed the same spot where the shivering woman had sat the night before. Her blanket was thin and torn. He looked down at his own, thick, army-issued, and warm, and paused. War had taught him to follow orders, but that night, something stronger than orders began to form in his mind. And that moment, quiet, small, almost invisible, would soon become the act that no one in that camp would ever forget. The next night at Camp Hearn was even colder. The air was sharp, and the moonlight made the frost on the ground look like a thin sheet of silver. The guards' boots crunched as they walked their rounds. Inside the women's barracks, most prisoners were asleep, their breaths forming small clouds in the air. But one woman, the same one Private James Larkin had noticed before, sat awake by the window. Her name was Elise Bauer, a 26-year-old typist from Munich. She held her knees close to her chest, whispering to herself in German, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. Larkin stood in the guard tower again. He looked down at the rows of huts, the barbed wire shining under the moon. It was quiet, too quiet. No one talked, no one cried out. Only the wind moved, carrying the distant hum of a train far away. But his eyes kept returning to the same barrack, the one with the woman sitting alone. He could see her outline, thin and still, her head bowed. Something in that sight made his chest tighten. He thought about his own family back home. His younger sister, Mary, was about Elise's age. She used to complain about cold nights too when the firewood ran low. He remembered how his mother would pull off her own blanket and wrap it around the children. "Warmth isn't just from fire," she used to say. "It's from kindness too." Larkin looked down at his thick army blanket, olive green, heavy and warm. He had two. The prisoners had one each, thin and rough. He thought about the rules. No unnecessary contact with prisoners. No giving personal items. He knew he could be punished for disobeying, but as he watched Elise shiver, his conscience argued louder than his training. Slowly, he climbed down the wooden steps of the guard tower. His boots sank into the frost. Every sound felt loud in the still air, the creak of wood, the soft thud of snow. He glanced around. The other guards were far at the gate, their backs turned. Larkin walked toward the fence, carrying his blanket folded under his arm. The barbed wire glinted faintly in the moonlight. On the other side, Elise looked up. She saw a shape moving in the dark, an American soldier walking toward her. Her heart raced. Fear rose in her throat. She had heard stories of soldiers in Europe doing terrible things to prisoners. She didn't move, just stared through the cold air as Larkin stopped at the fence. He didn't speak. He simply pushed the blanket through a gap in the wire. The rough wool brushed against her fingers. For a moment, both froze, the German woman and the American guard, two enemies, staring through the fence that divided them. Then, in a soft voice, Larkin said, "Warm. You need this." His German was poor, his accent heavy, but the meaning was clear. Elise blinked in confusion. She whispered, "Warum?" "Why?" He only smiled a little, shook his head, and stepped back toward the shadows. Elise pressed the blanket to her chest. It smelled faintly of smoke and soap, the scent of another life. She wrapped it around her shoulders and sat still for a long time. In her diary later she wrote, "It wasn't just a blanket. It was proof that the enemy had a heart." When the morning came, she told the others what had happened. Some didn't believe her, others thought it was a trap. But when they saw the thick American blanket around her, they went silent. One older woman whispered, "Perhaps kindness is stronger than war." Word of the act spread quietly among the prisoners. Even some guards heard rumors of a soldier giving away his blanket, but no one reported it. Perhaps they all understood that something good had happened, something small but deeply human. Larkin never spoke about it. He went back to his post, cold but strangely peaceful. The next day, when his sergeant passed by, he noticed the missing blanket and frowned. Larkin said only, "Lost it, sir." The sergeant nodded unimpressed and walked away. The secret stayed between him, the cold night, and the woman who would never forget his kindness. For Elise, that night changed everything she believed about her enemies. Before, she had seen Americans as faceless soldiers, powerful, distant, cruel. But now, when she looked at the guards, she saw people. She said later, in an interview after the war, "One man gave me warmth, and with it, he gave me hope again." That single act, silent, forbidden, and simple, began to spread like quiet fire through the camp, because kindness, once shown, cannot be unseen, and what started as one blanket would soon become a story shared across generations. The morning after Private Larkin gave away his blanket, Camp Hearn looked calm as usual. The guards walked their routes, the cooks prepared breakfast, and the prisoners lined up for roll call. But among the German women, prisoners, something had changed. They whispered quietly to each other, passing one story from mouth to mouth, about the American guard who had given his blanket to a freezing woman. No one knew his name and no one dared ask, but they all knew it had happened. The proof was there. Elise's thick army blanket, folded neatly on her bed. Inside the barracks, the women gathered close as Elise spoke in a low voice. "He said nothing," she told them. "He only smiled. He looked at me as if I was not his enemy, but someone who mattered." Her voice trembled slightly. An older nurse named Greta touched the blanket with care. "In Germany," she said softly, "a guard would never do this. Never." The women nodded. For the first time since capture, they didn't feel invisible. The act was small, just one blanket, but it carried meaning larger than food or warmth. It showed that mercy could exist even in a place built for war. Outside, the day was cold but bright. The sun glinted off the snow-covered ground, and the flag above the camp waved lazily in the wind. The American soldiers went about their work, most unaware that a quiet story was spreading behind the fences, a story that made the German women look at their captors differently. In the mess hall that afternoon, one guard noticed something unusual. When he served bread and soup to the prisoners, several women looked up and smiled softly. It was a small gesture, but in a war full of hate, even a smile was a powerful thing. One woman, Margot, later said, "The blanket became our symbol. It reminded us that we were still worth something, even if the world told us we were nothing." At night, Elise folded the blanket carefully and placed it at the foot of her bed. She couldn't sleep much. Her thoughts kept returning to the soldier's face. Why had he done it? Was it pity? Or something deeper? Something that said, even in war, humanity could still survive? Meanwhile, Larkin kept his secret. He didn't tell his friends or officers, but deep down, he felt proud. The next evening, when he passed by the same barrack, he saw the women sitting close together, sewing torn clothing and talking quietly. One of them looked up and nodded at him. It wasn't fear anymore in her eyes. It was gratitude. He nodded back. That moment, though wordless, said more than any speech could. Over the next few days, more small acts of kindness began to happen. A guard gave an extra piece of bread to a woman who looked ill. Another slipped a few matches through the wire so they could light a small fire to warm their hands. No one spoke about it openly, but everyone understood that something had changed in the air. The American guards began to see the women differently too. They were not soldiers, they were wives, daughters, and sisters, people caught in a war they didn't choose. One guard later wrote home, "They look like our own women would if the war came here." By the end of that week, the camp felt less like a cage and more like a fragile truce. The fences still stood, the rules still existed, but inside hearts had started to thaw. One night, when the sky was full of stars and the wind was quiet, Elise whispered to her bunkmate, "Maybe God sent that soldier." The other woman smiled softly. Maybe he sent the blanket. Years later, many of the women would say that the kindness they saw in America changed how they understood the war. It didn't erase their pain or guilt, but it gave them something they had lost long before, the belief that even in war, goodness could survive. As for Larkin, he would never know that his single act had become a legend inside the camp. A story told again and again in whispers. A story of one soldier who saw past the uniform and gave warmth to the enemy. And in a world frozen by hate, That small act became a spark that refused to die out. Winter stayed long in Texas that year. The wind kept blowing through the fences of Camp Hearn, and frost still formed on the windows each morning. But inside the camp, something unseen had begun to grow. A quiet change, started by one blanket. Before that night, most of the German women prisoners saw the Americans only as guards, as enemies. They spoke little, kept their heads down, and waited for orders. But after the story of Private Larkin's kindness spread, the air inside the barracks felt different. The women started to lift their eyes, to talk more freely, and even to laugh quietly among themselves. Elise noticed it first. In the mornings, when the guards brought water or food, some of the women greeted them with shy smiles. A few even practiced English words from small paper scraps. Thank you. Good morning, please. The Americans seemed surprised but answered politely. Slowly, walls that weren't made of wire began to weaken. Life in camp followed a strict routine. At sunrise, a whistle blew for roll call. Then came breakfast, usually oatmeal, bread, and sometimes eggs. After that, the prisoners worked in sewing rooms or the laundry building. Others helped in the kitchen, washing pots as big as barrels. The work was hard, but the food was better than what most had eaten during the war. For many, this was their first time in months eating 3 meals a day. A woman named Clara, who had been sick since capture, gained strength again. They feed us like people, she said one afternoon, not like prisoners. The American officers ran the camp with rules but not cruelty. They believed that if prisoners were treated well, they would behave well in return. And they were right. The German women became organized, helpful, and respectful. Even the guards noticed. One sergeant wrote in his report, "No trouble from the women. They keep to themselves, polite and quiet." But under that politeness, something deeper was happening, a lesson both sides were learning without knowing it. Larkin, meanwhile, kept his usual post. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He still walked his rounds every night, still shivered under his single thin blanket, but his heart felt lighter. Sometimes, when he passed near the women's barracks, he heard them singing softly in German, songs about home and hope. He couldn't understand the words, but the sound felt peaceful. One evening, as he stood by the fence, Elise approached. She held something in her hands, a small piece of bread wrapped in cloth. Carefully, she placed it on the ground near the wire and whispered, "For you." Larkin looked surprised. He shook his head, smiling. "No," he said softly, but she insisted. He finally nodded and picked it up after she stepped back. The bread was still warm. In that moment, both of them understood. Kindness had crossed the fence again, this time in the other direction. That night, the stars were bright, and the camp was silent, except for the sound of guards' boots on gravel. Larkin looked up at the sky and thought about how strange war was, how it could make enemies out of strangers, but also show how alike people truly were. Days turned into weeks. The camp settled into rhythm. The prisoners began decorating their barracks with paper flowers and small drawing. They even put on short plays to pass the time. Some American guards were invited to watch. They laughed at the jokes, even when they didn't understand all the words. In those moments, the fences seemed thinner, almost invisible. Elise often thought about that blanket. She kept it carefully folded every morning, a reminder of the night that changed her. Sometimes she told new arrivals, "Do not be afraid. These men are different. They know mercy." And the story continued to spread, quietly but powerfully. Each person who heard it carried it in their heart like a small flame, proof that one simple act could warm an entire world frozen by war. In a time when bombs fell and nations burned, a single blanket had become a bridge, one made not of wood or metal, but of kindness. And though none of them could see it yet, that bridge would outlast the war itself. By spring 1945, the war in Europe was ending. News came through radios and newspapers, cities in Germany falling, armies surrendering, leaders disappearing. Inside Camp Hearn, the German women gathered around the bulletin board every morning, reading what little news they could find. The war that had once felt far away was now collapsing at home. Many feared what was left of their families. Elise sat on her bunk one quiet afternoon, holding a pencil stub and a sheet of paper. The camp allowed prisoners to write 2 letters a month. The paper was thin, the ink faded, but the chance to write home meant everything. She wrote slowly, "We are safe. The Americans treat us well. One of them gave me his blanket." Those letters traveled far, across oceans and broken borders, until they reached villages still covered in dust and ruins. Families back in Germany, who expected horror stories, read instead about mercy. One mother told her neighbor, "They are not monsters. My daughter says they are kind word, spread through letters, through whispers, through hope." Private Larkin also wrote home. His letters were short, careful, and humble. "The prisoners here are mostly women. They are tired and scared. Sometimes I forget they are the enemy," he wrote to his sister in Kansas. "I gave one my blanket last winter. I didn't think much of it, but it seems they remember." His sister later said that was the only letter of his she kept. Life in the camp had softened. The guards had stopped shouting as much. The women worked in the garden, planting vegetables that grew fast under the Texas sun. They were allowed to keep a few flowers by their barracks. Small touches of color in a world still gray from war. A U.S. Army nurse, Lieutenant Anna Reeves, sometimes visited the women who were sick. She remembered how surprised she was by their manners. They were polite, gentle. "You could see they missed their families more than they feared us," she later said. She also noticed how much they talked about one American guard, the one who gave away his blanket. In her diary, she wrote, "They speak his name softly, like it's a prayer. For them, he is proof that war hasn't stolen all of humanity." Outside the camp, local townspeople were divided. Some thought the prisoners were being treated too well. Others, who had lost sons in Europe, came to understand that mercy was not weakness. A farmer once saw the German women working in the fields under guard and said, "If we treat them like people, maybe someday someone will treat our boys the same way overseas." Inside the camp, Elise kept writing. Every letter home was her way of keeping hope alive. Sometimes she told the others what she wrote and they nodded. One said, "When my children read this, they will know kindness still exists." The letters became small acts of peace in a world still healing from war. The Red Cross helped deliver them, and each envelope carried the same return address: Camp Hearn, Texas, United States Army. The women decorated their envelopes with tiny flowers or little hearts drawn in pencil. For them, those letters were lifelines. By the summer of 1945, Germany had surrendered. The camp buzzed with mixed emotions: joy, sadness, confusion. The women didn't know if they would go home soon, or where home even was anymore. Many towns in Germany had been destroyed. Some families were gone. One evening, a group of women sat outside near the fence watching the sunset. Elise spoke softly. "When I go home, I will tell everyone what happened here, that not all Americans were enemies." One shared his blanket. Larkin, from his post nearby, heard her words but didn't speak. He only looked out at the fading light and thought of how strange it was that something so small had meant so much. Weeks later, a reporter visited Camp Hearn. He took photographs of the prisoners and guards, and one picture showed Elise holding the same blanket. That image was later printed in a local newspaper under the headline, "Kindness Behind Barbed Wire." The war had ended, but the story of that moment had only begun. By late 1946, trains began to arrive outside Camp Hearn, ready to take the German prisoners back to Europe. The war was over. The camps were closing, and the world was trying to heal. Yet for many of the German women, leaving felt strange. Texas, the land of heat, dust, and distant kindness, had become a place they would never forget. Elise stood in line with the others, holding a small canvas bag that carried everything she owned: a comb, a few letters, and the faded American blanket she had been given. The blanket had torn edges now, but she folded it neatly, as if it were something sacred. The guards checked names one by one. Larkin was there, older and quieter than before. He didn't say much, but when he saw Elise, he nodded. She smiled back, a silent thank you between two people who had shared a moment of humanity in a place built for enemies. Before boarding, the women were given food: bread, apples, and coffee. Some cried as they ate. They remembered the fear they had felt when they first arrived, the cold nights, and the barbed wire that once looked endless. But now, those same wires seemed less cruel. They had survived. Elise looked around and said softly to a friend, "When I came here, I thought they would hate us. Instead, I learned something different." Her friend nodded, clutching her own letter home, one that she planned to hand-deliver when she returned. The train engines rumbled to life. As the cars began to move, several women leaned out of the windows, waving goodbye to the camp and the guards. Some waved to Larkin, too. He raised his hand slowly in return. He didn't smile, but his eyes carried warmth, the same warmth that once crossed the wire on a freezing night. For weeks, the trains carried prisoners through ports and across the Atlantic. Many had mixed emotions, happiness, fear, and uncertainty. When they reached Europe, they saw what war had truly done. Cities were broken, bridges gone, streets empty. Germany was no longer the country they had left behind. Elise's hometown had been bombed. The roof of her family's house was missing, and the streets were filled with rubble. But she still had her mother, who waited for her at the station, frail but alive. When her mother saw her daughter, she didn't ask about the camp. She simply hugged her and cried. Later, as they sat by the fire in what was left of their kitchen, Elise unfolded the blanket. Her mother touched it carefully and whispered, "This is American." Elise nodded. "Yes, it kept me warm when the nights were freezing." Her mother looked at her for a long time before saying, "Then it is not just a blanket. It is proof that kindness still exists." Many returning prisoners shared similar stories. They told neighbors that American guards had treated them fairly, sometimes even kindly. People were surprised. They had expected tales of cruelty. Instead, they heard about gardens, letters, music nights, and blankets shared through fences. In some German villages, those stories became symbols of hope. School teachers repeated them to children. Churches spoke of forgiveness. A few families even sent letters of thanks to American organizations, though they rarely knew the soldiers' names. Back in Texas, Larkin had already left the army. He worked at a hardware store and rarely spoke about the war. But one afternoon, a letter arrived with German stamp. It was from Elise. The handwriting was neat and careful. "You may not remember me, but I will never forget what you did. I still have your blanket. It reminds me that even in war, humanity can survive." He read the letter twice, folded it gently, and placed it inside his Bible. He never replied, but he kept it for the rest of his life. Years later, when he passed away, his family found that letter. The paper was yellow, the ink fading, but the words were clear, a message from another world, carried across time. His daughter read it aloud and whispered, "Now I understand who my father really was." The war had ended long ago, but the story of one small act of mercy still traveled from a cold night in Texas to the hearts of two families on opposite sides of the world. In 1951, 6 years after the war, a letter arrived at a U.S. Army office in Washington. It came from Germany, written in neat handwriting on thin paper, sealed with care. Inside were simple words. "Please help me find the man who gave me his blanket in Texas. I wish to thank him." It was signed, Elise Müller, and beneath it she had written, "He was kind when the world was cruel." The letter moved through military offices slowly. Many soldiers had returned home, changed jobs, or moved to new towns. Records were scattered, names forgotten. But one clerk, a young woman named Margaret Hayes, read the letter and couldn't ignore it. She copied the details, searched through old camp lists, and after weeks of work, she found the name Private James Larkin, once stationed at Camp Hearn, Texas. She sent the letter to his last known address. Months passed before a reply came. It was short, only one paragraph. "Yes," Larkin wrote, "I remember her. Please tell her she owes me nothing." The blanket was never mine to keep. It was America's kindness. Margaret sent both letters back to Elise with a note. "He remembers you." When Elise opened the envelope in her small German village, she smiled for the first time in months. The war had left scars, yet somewhere between Texas and Bavaria, the story of one blanket still lived quietly, passed from one person to another like a soft whisper of hope. In 1970, A historian collecting stories of POWs came across Elise's article, "The Blanket That Saved My Heart." He decided to include it in a book called Small Acts, Great Changes. When the book was released, readers from both countries wrote letters saying how the story touched them. One veteran wrote, "I carried a rifle, but that soldier carried something greater, compassion." At the same time, students in Germany began learning about how American POW camps had treated prisoners. Many were surprised. They had grown up hearing only about the bombing, the fighting, and the anger. But when teachers told them about Elise and Private Larkin, the classroom went quiet. For the first time, they saw a piece of history that showed mercy instead of hate. Elise was invited to speak at a school in Munich. She stood in front of the students with the old blanket folded neatly in her hands. "I was your age when I went to America," she said softly. "I thought the enemy would punish me. Instead, he gave me warmth." She didn't cry. She smiled. And when she finished, the students stood and clapped. In the audience was a young American exchange student named Michael Larkin, the son of the soldier who had given her that blanket. He had come to Germany to study history, never knowing that one of his father's actions would be part of what he read. After the talk, he introduced himself quietly. "My name is Larkin," he said. Elise looked at him for a moment, stunned. Then she placed her hand on the blanket and whispered, "Then your father was a good man." They talked for hours that day. Michael told her how his father had passed away 2 years earlier, still keeping her letter safe in a small box. Elise listened with tears in her eyes. "He gave more than a blanket," she said. "He gave me back my faith in people." Michael asked if he could take a photo of the blanket to bring home. Elise agreed, but she added, "Tell your children this story someday, not about war, but about what kindness can do." In the following years, the story spread once again. Newspapers and local radio programs shared it during anniversaries of the war. It wasn't the story of generals or great battles. It was the story of two ordinary people who did something simple yet unforgettable. By the 1980s, American veterans groups began including Elise's story in their newsletters, calling it the Blanket of Peace. Some even used it as a symbol during memorial events, reminding others that decency can survive even in war. In one small ceremony in Texas, a folded army blanket was placed on a podium beside a flag. Cars everywhere, empty homes, widowed mothers, and quiet hunger. But that letter reminded her that somewhere across the ocean, a stranger still believed in goodness. She showed it to her neighbors, who were rebuilding the church roof. "He was an American," she said softly, "and he did not see us as enemies." For a moment, the workers stopped hammering. They just listened. In a place where bitterness had lingered for years, the story felt like a light breaking through the clouds. Elise decided to share her story with others. She wrote a short article for a small regional newspaper titled "The Blanket That Saved My Heart." It was published in 1952. Readers were stunned. Letters began arriving at the paper from former POWs, widows, and even American families living in Germany. They all said the same thing. Kindness had left its mark. One letter came from a former German pilot who had been held in a camp in Nebraska. He wrote, "They gave us books, coffee, and respect. I came home defeated, but not humiliated." Another came from a nurse in Bavaria. "Your story made me weep. I thought the world had forgotten mercy." Over the next few years, Elise's story spread. Radio programs retold it, and in 1955, an American journalist included it in a report about the human side of war. The piece began with the line, "In a Texas camp, once meant for enemies, America won a different battle, the battle for the heart." Back in the U.S., Larkin heard about the article through a friend. He didn't seek attention, but when people asked, he only said, "It wasn't much. She was cold. I had a blanket." Yet he knew deep down it had meant far more. That night had become part of history, not through official reports or medals, but through memory. As the years passed, more connections like theirs appeared. American and German families wrote to one another, exchanging Christmas cards and stories. The children who once fought on opposite sides grew up and became pen pals. Teachers told Elise's story in classrooms, calling it the lesson of the blanket. A story not about battles, but about compassion. By 1960, Elise was working as a schoolteacher. She kept the blanket folded in a wooden chest at home. Its edges were frayed, the color faded, but it still carried the warmth she remembered. On cold nights, she would take it out and show her students. This, she would tell them, is how I learned that kindness is stronger than hate. Larkin, now a father of 2, lived quietly in Kansas. He never met Elise again, but sometimes he would take out her letter and read it by the light of his porch lamp. When his son asked, "Did you really give your blanket to a prisoner?" he smiled and said, "Yes, son, and maybe that's the only part of the war I got right." That small act, once hidden in the shadows of war, had grown into something larger, a reminder that even in history's darkest winters, one human gesture could thaw the ice between enemies. Years later, both America and Germany were very different. The war was long over, cities were rebuilt, and nations were learning how to live with their memories. A speaker said, "This stands for the mercy that made us human." When Elise passed away in 1992, her family placed the same blanket in a local museum. On the tag they wrote, "Given by an American guard to a German POW, 1944, a gift of warmth and forgiveness." Visitors often stopped in front of it longer than any other exhibit. Many said it was the simplest thing in the room, yet the one that made them feel the most. Back in America, Michael Larkin visited the museum years later. He stood quietly in front of the display, reading the note his father had once written. "It was never mine to keep," he smiled softly. "Maybe it was," he whispered, "just in another way." The story of Elise and Larkin became part of history books, but more than that, it became a lesson. A reminder that even in times of war, kindness can outlast hatred. They had been enemies by order, but not by heart. As one historian later wrote, "Empires fall, leaders change, but small human acts, like giving a blanket, build the peace that lasts." In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs or armies. It was compassion, the power to see humanity in someone who was once called the enemy. That single act of warmth crossed oceans, melted fear, and reminded the world that sometimes the smallest gift can leave the largest mark on history.